Welcome to the Work is Weird Now podcast. Whether you're nearing retirement, entering the workforce for the first time, or caught somewhere in the confusing muddle in the middle, you're likely sensing it and you're probably living it. We know we are, and we want to know why. Listen in as we interview experts and everyday people like you to find out how best to navigate the ever-growing weirdness of work in the modern age.
Welcome to the Work is Weird Now podcast. Today's guest is Christian Hunt. So how did I come to learn about Christian? So I was having a roast dinner with friends and was chatting away about the podcast. And my friend said, well, you have to meet Christian. You have to have him on the podcast. So I reached out and we had a really engaging discovery call. And here we are. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're excited. So, Christian is a thought leader in behavioural science, former MD at UBS, and today he's got a company called Human Risk, helping clients understand human risk, and also a podcast host and author. We're going to learn lots about you today. But first, we start every podcast with what is your weird work moment of the week? Alice, what is yours?
So mine was this week. I was meeting with a new client around leadership and that sort of thing, leading towards the world of AI, sort of appropriate topic to be tackling as business right now. And it was really interesting because their whole stance was what they wanted to be talking about related to AI externally and related to their clients. And I asked the question, well, how are you messaging AI internally to your own people? And it was just sort of blank stares. And it's really just this recurring theme in my life right now, which is nobody's actually thinking about how they talk about it internally, at least none of the people that I'm speaking to, none of the companies. And for me, I think it's a good topic of conversation for today, because that feels like an enormous risk from a brand and marketing and positioning point of view. And so, yeah, hopefully we can get into that a little bit more, but it was a weird moment having these blank stares. But also whenever I see blank stares, I think, ooh, business opportunity. So that was useful. What about you, Dan?
So mine's a behavioural one, and it's something that I'm still unpicking. So I left full-time corporate employment November last year, and I had that whole I have to be at my desk at 8 o'clock, and I thought it would have unraveled a little bit more now, but yesterday on Thursdays I've joined a running club, and take the word running lightly, it's plodding at best for me. But it's at 6:15 in the morning, and on this day they were going for like a beach sauna because we live down in Brighton, and I was like, yeah, I want to do it. And then I was like, oh my God, hang on, but I won't be at my desk till like what time? And I was at my desk for 9 o'clock, showered, clean, present, all of those things. But I still had that like not at my desk for a certain time feeling, even though it's been, so long. I still had a really productive day. I didn't miss anything, but I'm still unpicking those behaviors that have been ingrained in me around presenteeism almost. And it felt weird, felt really weird. Christian, what's yours?
Well, so as we'll come on to discover, I sort of have a belief that to be really good at my job, I need to find the inspiration in unusual places. And so so I spent half my time in London, half my time in Munich. I'm in Munich at the moment. And yesterday I was in Cologne because there's someone I connected with during the pandemic online, and we'd never kind of managed to meet face to face. And he was visiting his sister in Cologne. He's like an accountant CFO type. And I was like, well, what are we going to spend the day doing? And I've discovered that there was this calculator museum, like no joke, the history of calculating. So I was like, for a laugh, I'll take him there, right? Because it'd be on brand for his job. And you know what? It was brilliant. It was one of the most incredible, like this weird, very eclectic mix of kind of counting machines and all, and modern day calculators and whatever. And I was expecting it to be really dull, and it was just incredible. And it just reminded me, we have these sort of prejudices. And I think there's something really infectious about people with sort of slightly weird. This was an academic that decided to start collecting these things, and they turned it into this museum. And I wasn't expecting to love it. I thought it'd be a bit dull, but quite thematically funny. But it was just amazing. So I'm like really geeking out about calculators, and I was not expecting that at the beginning of the week.
I am a firm believer that the more niche the museum, the better the museum is, for sure. I've definitely been to some weird ones over the years, like tucked down alleys in strange cities. So yeah,
maybe there's a new podcast in there. What's the weirdest museum you've ever been to?
Yeah.
There we go. And we ask all of our guests: are you where you thought you'd be in your career right now?
So, I was thinking about this, and I think I'm exactly where the little Christian would have expected me to be. I wouldn't have had any clue about what careers meant, but the sorts of things that I do and the kind of questions I'm asking and helping other people to answer, he would absolutely he'd be like totally happy with this. But the more adult version of me, I guess the undergrad would be probably horrified, because I started my career very sensibly I did a literature degree. And then I was like, I must do something business relevant. So I went and qualified as an accountant. And ironic, given the museum I've just mentioned, I hate maths. I'm not a big fan of it at all. I was terrible at it. But I will do a sensible qualification to counter out my degree. So having started on that path, I've then unwound that sensible thing to find myself where I am. So I went into banking because that paid really well, and then became an accidental regulator after the crisis, because they were looking for people that weren't natural regulators, and then ended up eating my own regulatory cooking. And that led me to doing what I do now. And so my whole career, I can give you the LinkedIn version or the kind of interview beat, and then logically I moved and did this, and then I did that, the kind of with hindsight logic. But the honest answer is I've kind of made it up as I've gone along. And I think what happened was I did that thing a lot of people do, which is here's the sensible path. And then I've slowly found myself meandering off the sensible path into the space where I think I belong, where I love what I do. So I would say if I've finally found something that works for me. So I'm definitely being true to the younger version of me, but the kind of adult sensible version would, I think, horrified is probably the wrong word, but shocked would probably be about there.
Yeah. So I've got a question. Do you think work is weird now?
So, well, I think work's always been weird. So the bit I would kind of challenge a little bit is the now, because I think it's always been a bit odd. It's just that we're allowed to talk about it now, right? And we've sort of, I think we've wised up a little bit. And if there was any benefit to COVID, and recognizing that there, I don't want to make light of it, there's loads of disbenefits, but it did sort of give us permission to challenge some of those things. And I think that sort of turbocharged, I think, what was going on anyway, which was a general recognition. And I'm fascinated by structures in the world. The working week would be a good example. The school year, which, the school year used to match the agricultural year, so the kids were free to bring in the harvest. Well, we don't need that anymore, and yet we still maintain these legacy structures. And I think the way we teach kids, I haven't been to school for many decades, but nonetheless, I still think it's missing the mark. We teach people a lot of theoretical things and not practical things. And so as I look at work, I'm not sure work has ever, in the modern world, given the things that we can now do, I'm not sure it's ever been anything other than weird. But I think now we're starting to expose this. And I think it's kind of like, we're a little bit like, what I love about your show is it's a little bit like the kid in the Emperor's New Clothes, right? It's pointing and just going, what the hell, right? This is not normal, and we should call this stuff out. And so yeah, I think it's kind of like, it's about time, right, that we start to ask these questions.
Yeah. And that's the whole point of this. Alice and I have personally felt these moments of tension of like, we've done 20 odd years in our career. Is this it for the next 20 years? But normalizing the weirdness of it and saying, right, well, what things do we want on the table to talk about here, to shine a light on it and just let people know that it's okay to feel that weirdness, and there's alternative routes if you're feeling really stuck. Have you felt any of those moments? Like, is this how you've ended up, creating human risk? Is that how you ended up there?
Yeah, so what I do is I help organizations to think about the risks posed by human decision making. In other words, when things go wrong in organizations, there's always a human component involved. And so if we want to stop undesirable outcomes from occurring, whatever those might be, we should think about the humans that will be a key driver of that. And when things go wrong, it's either a human causing the problem or making it worse by the way they react, or in many cases don't react to it. And so that's a sort of negative formulation. There is a more positive formulation, which is looking and saying, actually, the opposite of human risk, I would define as human reward, just because those words match, which is looking, how do we design environments that get the best out of people? If we're spending a ton of money on people, and they are a big cost factor in organizations, then shouldn't we try and design environments that get the best out of them? And those two things are interrelated. If you unleash people to do whatever they want, they will be brilliant, but they will also be appalling. So we need to control that. But equally, if you control them in a way that says, I don't trust them, you won't get the best out of them. And so there's this delicate balancing act that we have in the and that's what I'm helping people to think about, is how do we assess that risk? How do we mitigate it? How do we design environments that get the best outcomes from the people that we're hiring? And I came to that through this really weird experience. So I mentioned that I'd done the accountancy thing, but we won't talk about that again. I then went into banking, and then, as I said, after the 2008 crisis, they were looking for people to regulate the industry who could bring a different perspective, who weren't natural regulators, because they recognized that the regulators had made some mistakes, right? And so regulators are filled with people, so you kind of want different perspectives there. And so I kind of was approached by a headhunter and ended up, I literally almost accidentally, didn't apply for the job. They came to me, and then I went through the interview process, and the more we went through the process, the more And then having had this experience, I then realized they broke the regulator up, moved it to the Bank of England. I became COO at the regulator, and then realized I didn't want to be a central banker. So I went to work for UBS, which was the bank that I had spent most of my time supervising. And as anybody that's worked in a regulated industry knows, if a regulator is looking at you a lot, it's not because you're doing a stellar job. Like the firm had all sorts of issues, like a rogue trader in London that I'd had to manage. So I kind of knew the firm really well. They knew me. And in the UK, unusually, you're allowed to move between regulator and regulatee. It's seen as a good thing. And so I ended up eating my own regulatory cooking. In other words, having to implement the stuff that I had imposed on the firm. And the bit of the firm that I was responsible for risk and compliance in was the one bit of the firm that hadn't historically had any issues. So as a regulator, I hadn't been thinking about this particular business division. And what landed in my lap, and I say landed in my lap in the sense of I had to implement this stuff and I had to own it. So I would get emails from myself, from the machine, telling me to go on training courses that I thought were really dumb. Right? And everybody else was getting this email from me, and I would own policies that I was like, what the hell? I don't understand this. This makes no sense. And it made sense organizationally, but didn't necessarily the way it landed. And that's the point where I just kind of went, look, there's something weird here. What's going on? And I kind of went, oh, it's the people that we're not thinking about the people. We're just kind of thinking organizationally. We're not thinking about the people on whom we are imposing this stuff for very good reason. Right? I'm not critical, but it wasn't landing. And I was just like, if it's not landing with me and I know where this stuff has come from, it's not going to land with anybody else. And that's when I started to question, what were we doing and how were we doing it? And could we do it better? And that's where this idea of behavioral science, which is a key part of what I do, is bringing behavioral science into this field of thinking, how do I get through to these people and not presume that just because they're employed, they will care about some of these things? Because some rules that we have to comply with are a pain in the backside. So how do we translate this organizational objective into things that make sense for individuals? How can we recognize what is difficult for people to comply with or might irritate them, whatever, that makes it less likely they're going to comply with these rules or that they might pose a risk? And so I started to unpick that. And I guess that's a good illustration to sort of bring us back to the topic. That's a really good illustration of how I started to question the way things were being done. And when I pointed to the little Christian who would have loved what I do now, because I was brought up as a kid who would ask really pain in the backside questions that are really inappropriate moment. I would point at people in the street and go, why is he wearing that? Like, not in an attempt to embarrass my parents, but that's sort of what happened. I was just really curious and they indulged that. And so I think I've always had this curiosity as to why do we do the things that we do? And stuff that, I don't know, I have a visceral reaction to certain things. And a visceral reaction, I think, is a bit of interesting feedback that we ought to do something about. And so stupid rules and processes annoy me. And here I was responsible for implementing, standing behind silly rules and things. So how could we? And so that began my whole questioning of the way that we do things. And so what I'm doing now is I would argue it's disruptive. I'm not trying to disrupt an industry. I'm trying to disrupt an approach and an attitude. And so I'm not sure conventional wisdom works in the way that we would hope it does. And so I want to kind of challenge this a little bit. We're spending a ton of money on risk, compliance, HR, cybersecurity, all these things. Ultimately, we're trying to influence people. How can we do that more effectively?
Yeah, so I don't know a whole lot about the financial industry, but I have worked for many construction companies over the years and have looked at health and safety and compliance from that perspective repeatedly. One of the sort of eureka moments for me in trying to understand what the kind of compliance obligations were of those types of organizations, especially the global businesses, they're facing so many rules and regulations of such complexity and such variation depending on where they are, and things are changing so quickly. And what was quite striking to me is that the chances of being audited across all those channels, all those compliance channels, is directly related to being caught doing something bad in the first place, right? So if you have one accident, then you've got eyes on you, then you've got all that kind of analysis around whether or not you're compliant. So actually, I had this moment where I thought, okay, so wait, the goal shifts from being compliant on all fronts to preventing accidents, which of course demands a wider approach to changing and embedding behaviors that keep people and systems safe, right? So that, I think, was the kind of shift in my understanding. It sounds like that's what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Your start point of I don't know much about financial services is fascinating because that's my background. But I now work with everybody ranging from UN chemical, weapons inspectors, the military, financial services obviously there, but pharmaceuticals through to tech companies. And the reason that what I do is portable, if you like, is that because it's all about humans. So you could change the context in which you're having to do things. And, I always have these conversations. People go, we're a very unique organization. And that is always true up to a point, because ultimately the dynamics of getting people to follow rules in a different context, there are things that we can learn that are portable across those things, because the human OS that we're all running on is the same across the piece. So what's really interesting is the read across. And one of the powerful things that I'm able to do is to work in different contexts and bring insights that they don't have themselves. So we may solve a problem in financial services by looking at what they do in, UN chemical weapons inspectorates, right? Which makes it, on the face of it, it seems really illogical. But if you then look at the problem, which is fundamentally how do we get people to do things, then that's the bit that we're looking at. And you're absolutely, it's really interesting as well, your point about, we'll get into, like, if something badly goes wrong, we are under greater scrutiny. And I think this idea of 100% compliance, the sort of the general attitude is if we don't have 100% compliance, we've failed. Well, that's absurd, because we all know in our day-to-day life, we all mess things up. We get things wrong. Every single one of us breaks a law. I want to say on a daily basis, but for at least once a week, you will be breaking a law of some kind. It might be, hopefully, right, nothing major, right? Nobody on this is
speeding rather than murder.
Right, so bank robberies or murder or that it's not that level, but the kind of like crossing the light when it's red, right, or breaking a speed limit slightly, or just doing something that we shouldn't do, right? We all do that. And so 100%, I would say 100% compliance is neither possible nor desirable. And the reason I say it's not desirable is there are some outcomes you don't want, right? You don't want people to die. You don't want people to get injured. You don't want to cause massive reputational risk. You don't want people's personal data sprayed all over the internet. So there are things you don't want to have happen. But there's other things that you can actually live with. And I think the focus of sort of pretending every single rule and risk poses the same challenge to an organization is silly. We should be looking at it and say the really important stuff that really, really matters of life and death would be a good example. Let's focus on that and let's make sure those things don't happen. And the approach that you might adopt for that would be different to something where you go, well, I'd rather it didn't happen, but if it does happen, we can handle it. We can cope, right? And so we want to try and, my view is always we want to try and nudge the humans into screwing up in places where either it doesn't matter or whisper it, it's actually beneficial. Because if you think about research and development, that is all about screwing up. And so when we've got organizations that by default are trying to develop new products and services and be innovative, right, to survive, then on the one hand, we're saying to individuals, those organizations, go ahead and screw up, right? You have to screw up in order to find the right answer. And so I think we have to recognize the reality. So it's unrealistic, I think, for regulators to expect firms to be 100% compliant. It's also unrealistic within firms. And the moment you break that myth and you go, actually, let's think about what really matters. You will, to your point, you will get yourself out of trouble because you've actually started to calibrate these things. There are laws that none of us want to break because we don't want to get into trouble. And there's other laws where we go, I don't really care. It's a stupid rule. May not even know the rule exists.
So how do you then do that? I don't know whether we could go through a real life example, but how do you do that and support businesses? Like, where do you find is it 80-20? I don't know. Like, what do you do when you go into a business and figure all this out?
Well, so the first thing to say is that I can only work with that sounds a really facile statement now. I can only work with people that want to work with me. Right? Let me unpick that slightly because it sounds a bit silly. Right? By which I mean, what I am proposing is an alternative view of the work. So I'm saying we need to think behaviorally, recognize things from the perspective of the people whose behaviors we're trying to influence. And that requires a shift because the traditional logic uses what I call the employment contract fallacy. We employ you so we can tell you what to do, right? Legally correct. But if you think about that, if we spend our whole life telling people what to do, we treat them like they're small children, then at some point we're going to irritate the hell out of them and that runs out of road. And that means they're not going to respect us. And when we need them to be engaged and participative, there's a qualitative component to compliance. They're less likely to do it. So we have to balance times when we're going to tell people what to do and times where we might want to just take a little bit more of a step back and maybe nudge them in the right direction or whisper it, not worry about it at all because it's not a major risk. So those sorts of questions about what matters and what doesn't is down to the people within the organization, right? It's not for me to determine what matters to them because I always say to them, you will always know more about your business than I ever will as an outsider. And so my intention is not to come in and tell you how to run your business. It is to give you a lens through which you can start to look at the world differently. So to start to think a bit more behaviorally. And so I'm not coming in and answering that question. What I'm doing is equipping them to answer it. Because if we want to change things sustainably within organizations, then it needs to be owned by the people within the organization. Otherwise, the moment I leave, this thing falls apart. So they need to own it. And particularly in a regulated environment where you will have to justify what you are doing to an external body, whether it's a regulator or some other authority, you kind of need to be able to own that. And so I try and equip my clients with a toolkit that they can use for two reasons. One is so that if it doesn't work, and we have to accept that when we're trying to influence people's behavior, a little bit like ad campaigns, they don't always land the way we expect. We may have to course correct a bit. You can only course correct if you understand what's happened. So they need to be able to course correct and manage it. I don't want to be like the dodgy plumber where we fix something and then it turns out not to have been fixed properly. And then they have to, that's another call out charge, right? I think that's unethical. So I want to make sure they're equipped to be able to, if they get the same problem again, they don't need to call me out. But then the second piece is that owning it, where you can go, if you need to stand up and say, this is why we're doing things, particularly if we're doing things like removing controls. Often the solution to things going wrong is more and more controls. Well, actually, more controls can make things riskier for behavioral reasons. So if we're doing things that are counterintuitive, you need to be able to own it. And so the brilliant answer to your question, Dan, is I don't have to do that. That's not what I'm about. What I'm doing is helping them do it. So they will know what the risky bits, what outcomes are they looking to achieve. What I'm helping them to do is to find the toolkit to recognize where either where they don't know that it's not happening and to help them to detect where it might be a problem, or to design things in a way that makes it more likely they get the outcomes they want.
So at the moment, when you're working with organizations, what are some of the biggest, most entrenched misconceptions about human behavior?
The number one is that we are logical, right? That we example would be just because something is important to the organization, that the employee 100% accepts that and agrees with it and understands it and will follow it. So, you get this disconnect between organizations often talk about, we need to do this for the good of the organization. Now, that logic works, I think, back in a traditional employer. If you were only ever going to work for one employer for the whole of your life and you're wedded to that employer and you're never going to leave, then maybe you do think longer term about your particular employer. Now, I'm not suggesting anybody comes to work and goes, how can I take this organization down? There will be a small number of people that are thinking like that. The average employee sort of shows up and wants to do a good job, right? Doesn't want to screw up. But we confuse what the individual is thinking with what the organization is thinking. We sort of assume that we just indoctrinate them and then they will be on board because we've given them a job and their interests are aligned with ours. And so I often see clashes between what is good and convenient for the organization, for which read good and convenient for the people who are running the exercise. So, we'll do training at a cadence that works for us as an organization, right? Annual processes, in many cases, are just nonsenses, right? They're done for the convenience of whoever it is needs to say they've done the process. But we don't learn on an annual basis. Things don't happen on an annual basis. They happen on a sort of minute-by-minute basis. So, induction training, good example, right? You join an organization and you get, so I'm thinking larger organizations here, you're put into a room with a load of other people and they've taken your passport or your ID away. It's like, welcome to big company. We're really big. And you're like, I know this because I've applied for a job here. I'm not confused about the scale of the organization. And then they go, let's talk about ethics. We are a very ethical organization. You kind of sit there and go, why are they telling me this, right? Are they not ethical? Why are they wanging on about being ethical? That's a bit weird. We have 500 offices across I don't need to know any of this. What I'm thinking is, when am I getting my passport back? Have I made a big mistake? Who are all these other people sitting in the room? Is the food any good? What's the gym like? What time can I get out of here? All those kind of thoughts, right? We're not thinking, please take me through your risk framework. Now, of course, there are certain things we need to tell people where the fire escapes are, all that kind of stuff, right? But there's a load of things we dump on them induction training for the convenience of the organization, not for the convenience of the employee. And I think the effort that we go into to hiring people to make it sound like an appealing place to is undone often by just the first point of contact is the induction training. Why do we make those boring and tedious in a way that nobody kind of goes, yeah, induction training? It's like, oh God, I'm going to have to sit through this thing. Why do we do that? And it's even worse because if you kind of misrepresent in the induction training, you go, we're a very ethical organization and we all blah, 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 blah. Everybody here is happy, right? And then you go out and you see the reality and you realize pretty quickly you'll work it out for yourself. And if the reality you experience is miles away from the induction training, two things will happen. Firstly, you're going to go with the reality. So they can tell you how ethical they are in the induction training, but you're going to behave according to the ethical norms within the organization. So the first thing is it's useless because you'll work it out for yourself. But the second thing is you've signaled to them early on that you're delusional, right? That you don't really live in the real world. And so when we look at that's just one example of a process where I say, I think the significance of induction training is missed because I think this is your opportunity to make a really good first impression. And what do? We put people through hell. And it's completely unnecessary. As I say, there's a small number of things that we all get, we have to do. We all have a tolerance for that. But that's a really good illustration, I think, of where you haven't, back to the question, you'll notice I meander off, but I'll try and get us back to the question. That's a good example of a presumption where you go, what the organization feels it wants to tell employees, brackets, to keep the lawyers happy, is not at all what the employee is thinking at that point in time. And the bit I love is you wouldn't treat your customers like that, right? You wouldn't, if you create a clunky process that irritates the hell out of customers, you don't have customers anymore.
Yeah, one influences the other, directly influences the other.
And we don't think about it. So I think back to the question, the biggest misconception I think there is that there is an alignment between those two things. And we don't think about, the big phrase that I use that's common is, we often think about how we would like people to behave rather than how they are likely to behave. By which I mean we have a stylized version where every employee is never tired, doesn't have other things in mind, would never consider going to work for an alternative employer, will do whatever we tell them to do, regardless of how painful it is. That's delusional. What we need to do is recognize the reality of how real humans in the situations that we're putting them in or that they find themselves in are likely to behave. Now, that's not to say that we go, oh, they find this a bit tedious, we let them off. What I'm saying is if there's a process that's really tedious, we recognize that it's tedious and we say, can we make it less tedious? And the answer to that might be yes, we can make it less tedious. Or maybe they perceive it's tedious, but it's actually really important. We just haven't explained why it's important. So trying to find a way to get through. And if we can't do that, we can't either change the reality or the perception of the reality. What we can potentially do is to say, okay, that poses a higher risk. And so from a behavioral perspective, a process that is bureaucratic, tedious, painful, that stops the natural flow of people doing business poses a greater risk because you go, which rules am I likely to break? The ones I think are a pain in the butt that stop me hitting the sales target that you've also set me. And so, that as presumption that people will behave logically or what you think is logical is massively flawed.
It's interesting what you say about induction, because I've been saying forever from in the brand world, that is what we call like a cultural defining moment, right? Because you have people's attention. It means a lot to people how they experience the business on the first day. I always relate it to childbirth, right? You go in, you have your baby. It's the most important day of your life. And for the midwife, it's a Tuesday, right? It doesn't matter to her. And so you always get this feeling in inductions like it's a Tuesday for the people delivering it. But for the people sitting in the room, this is a meaningful thing that will actually shape how they perceive the company for years to come. So you kind of have to get that moment right.
And I think it's sort of, this is never explicitly said, but there's an implicit kind of, you are very lucky to have joined this select, but we are bestowing on you the honor of working for this amazing place, right? Rather than thinking about, probation periods, I think go both ways, right? Is that the firm works out, because it's effectively a way of going, have we made a mistake, right? And so I think that's an interesting thing where the sort of probation period, I need to pass the probation period. I think we should flip that narrative as well and go, the employee should also be sitting there going, this is a probation period for them, right? Have I made a mistake? And I think there's a little bit of shame, this concept people talk, job hopping. If you have made a terrible decision, you've joined an organization that turns out to be awful, then there is absolutely no shame in having your own version of the probation period and going, I'm done, right? Maybe if you keep picking employers where that's a problem, that says something about you. But I think we should all be allowed this. And yet there's this narrative of, you got to stick it out, you got to stay, which I think is just, to coin a phrase, weird, right? We should look at these things and go, nobody is going to 100% pick the right employer for them all the time. And no employer is going to get the recruitment process 100% correct. We're going to see what happens and we'll work it out. And so I think we should be thinking in those terms. And that's where, I think the induction thing, to your point, is if you think about it in those terms, then we shouldn't be sort of propagandizing employees. We should be trying to make them feel as welcome as possible, as happy that they've joined, give them the bits of information they need, and then drip feed them whatever else we need to tell them in a reasonable time period so that we're treating them, guess what, like humans.
So I assume that means that you don't believe that everybody is capable of being nudged towards a certain set of behaviors. In other words, if an organization has a profile of behavior that they're trying to achieve, then they have to be choosing from the outset the right personalities and behaviors that pre-exist that context in order to achieve that. Is that true?
I wouldn't want to necessarily be drawn on a sort of simplified model, but what I would say is that, clearly there are going to be certain organizations that are not suitable for certain individuals. I'll come back to politics, right? We've seen certain politicians in senior positions who, let's just say, I don't think have the necessary skills to be in office. They might have the campaigning skills, but they don't necessarily have the skills to be sitting in office. And so I think we need to be a little bit more honest around things and say, look, what are we hiring? What are we hiring for? What attributes do we want people to have displayed? Now, often we look at sort of, past experience and things that one might associate with privilege. And that becomes the sort of benchmark. I'm more of a fan of saying, do they have the raw capabilities to be successful within this organization? So we want to hire diverse range of people, right? Because that's better for decision making, and it's also morally the right thing to do. It represents society better, all those kinds of things, right? Risk management is better done if you have a diverse range of people. So I think we need to be really careful when we're setting those criteria, because if you take the suggestion that you were saying, Alice, that you could use that as an excuse to not hire a more diverse range. But we need people with lots of experience in this industry because that's how we know this will work out. I would argue the opposite. Yes, that's great, but you also want people that have this limited experience in that space, who have the aptitude, who can learn. So we need to balance these things out a little bit. And I'm always worried about kind of prescriptive solutions to those things, because they are often abused by people that have an agenda. What I would say is that we need to start thinking about, the fact that there will be a very small number of people, and I don't want to put percentage on it, but it'll be low single digits probably within an organization, who are setting out to do the wrong thing, right? Who are there for bad, malicious reasons. And we need to weed those people out. There will also be a very small percentage of people that will never do anything wrong at all, right? Which on the face of it sounds great. And then you go, that's also a bit weird, right? So I always say to people, watch the two extremities. The people that are constantly breaking your rules are a problem. The people that are never breaking your rules are also a problem, because if you really want to break the rules, you wouldn't want to appear on any radar, right? You'll look like your goody two-shoes, because they won't then look at me. And so those people are a bit weird as well. The vast majority of people are persuadable within a range. So you can make them, you can irritate them and drive them to being badly behaved. You can incentivize them to be badly behaved, or you can do the opposite. And so I prefer to look at the world in those lenses. And what's interesting is that most organizations, particularly compliance type people, focus on the negative outcomes, right? You go, we had this incident occur. We don't want that to happen again. We've recognized that every employee poses a risk. So we're going to treat them all as if they are a risk to the organization. And we're going to tell them that we're watching them the whole time. We're going to basically not trust them. Now, that's a really dangerous approach, but it's so tempting to do because you're focusing on the thing you don't want to have happen. So I prefer to think about the segmenting the population in those ways. I think recruitment processes do need to recognize that not every job will be suitable for every person. And we can think about that in terms of physical attributes. There are going to be certain roles where you require physical strength, where it might be, there are going to be certain things that require a certain mental aptitude. We're not all going to be gifted fighter pilots. And so we want to make sure that people have that natural aptitude. And I think, none of us are born racist. I suspect none of us are born unethical, but we can develop attribute. Our upbringing will play a role in that. And so I think we have to recognize that there will be some people that we probably don't want to hire because their track record suggests that their worldview or their behavior patterns is not the sort of thing that we want to bring into our organization, because no matter how strong our culture is, we're not going to, somebody that has demonstrated they are a charlatan and behaves in another, or a bully, is likely to demonstrate those behaviors again. And so we want to kind of be looking out for that kind of thing. But this is really hard. And this is why I think when we're recruiting people, we need to recognize that some of the things that we have used as proxies, I would argue like a university degree, it's a lazy heuristic for you're smart. But there's tons of people that have been to university that are not intelligent, right?
And vice versa.
It's a byword for, and then if you add in things like privilege, I went to a really good university. Now, I got in, so there's something there, but I'm not for 1 minute sitting there going, well, that makes me far more intelligent than the average people, because it's just nonsense, right? And then there's intellectual. If you think about what does intelligence mean, there's EQ and IQ. And not every job requires people with high IQs do stupid things, right? Because they don't understand the real world. So what I'm painting there is, I guess, is a much more complex picture. But I do think the models that we use to make the selection criteria are often flawed. I'm not saying there is a perfect model out there, but let's recognize those models are flawed and therefore think about how what can we do to try and mitigate the risks of what will inevitably be a flawed model.
Yeah. Okay. Obviously, with AI, we're facing sort of existential questions about humans, primarily what are humans for compared to sort of super intelligence and agentic AI and things like that. But also, we've built an entire system, arguably based on our own fallibility. So it now, again, arguably falls to us to provide the ethical steer to sort of keep AI in check. And based on your understanding of humanity and behavior, how optimistic are you about our ability to do that effectively?
So I thought you might go down this line. So I was just reflecting on that this morning. And LinkedIn, I think, is always recognizing that, again, there's an algorithm behind that piece. But so if you were to look at LinkedIn, I sort of see, in very simplistic terms, two different camps, right? You've got the doomsday people. This is terrible. This is going to destroy humanity. It's the worst thing ever. And then you've got the kind of fanboys and girls who think it's the best thing ever. It's incredible, blah, blah, blah. Right? The truth, as ever, lies somewhere between those two things. And so I sit there and say, look, if we don't keep this thing in check, we've already seen what social media and mobile devices is doing to people, right? And you know, there's so much research out there, and we know the negative impact it has on all of us, and you know, just even some of my own interactions there. We all say things online that we would never dream of saying to someone's face. But it's okay. We're flying behind the keyboard, you know. Going. So as I look at it, I think it's both of those things at once. Right? There's a massive risk that if we just unleash AI without thinking about the consequences, and we put it in charge of decisions where actually we need the human touch, or where historic data could lead to a bad outcome. You know, we are going to entrench prejudices, biases, all those sorts of things if we're not careful. So I want to watch that particular thing. I think it's also dangerous when we think about things like intellectual property, right? All that sort of stuff as well. Just unleashing it, you know, just because we can deploy it somewhere doesn't necessarily mean we should. The flip side is I think it's absolutely brilliant as a tool if you understand the limitations and you use it in the right way. And, you know, I see lots of people out there who sort of go, well, it's hallucinating. It's like they treat it like it's a crap version of Google. And my view is like, it's not, you have to understand what it can do and what it can't do. And so, you know, if I were looking at something where accuracy really, really mattered, or originality mattered, right? Then I have to be careful because I have to understand how AI works. And I've spent a lot of time playing with it to try and get my head around some of these things. But if I look at the positives, it's much more fun to talk about the positives. It's a brilliant tool for creativity. You know, I use it quite a lot I see these things on LinkedIn. AI, terrible. People shouldn't be using AI for social media posts. I think they should. They shouldn't be getting the AI to write the post and just copy and pasting it. But I love it. I often put my post through it and just go, am I missing something here? Could this potentially be offensive to somebody? You know, or if I've had an exchange with somebody on Messenger and I'm like, I don't know where they're coming from, or give me an angle on something I'd never thought of before. So as a creative tool, it's phenomenal, and it's a great challenge because it doesn't care about my feelings. So it can challenge me and tell me that what I've said is, you know, it might be offensive to certain people. Here's a better way you potentially phrase it. So, you know, when I look at that and I look at the potential for medical deployment where we can spot diseases well before humans can spot them and be more accurate, and so I'm simultaneously massively excited and terrified. And the reason I'm terrified is not so much I'm a doomsday thing, because I think we have seen, and particularly where we have some of the tech overlords, for want of a better phrase, are not people who I think can be trusted to do certain things. And that's not necessarily a critique of them, because I suspect the vast majority of us, if we were in the same position, would probably develop some of those tendencies. I think it's a natural function of having loads of money, loads of influence, and a certain type of ego that comes with all of that, or is required to get to that position, that I think poses those problems. So I'm sitting on the fence here of saying I think it's an amazing opportunity. It poses a huge amount of risk. And the final point, and I will stop talking in a second, the final point is, if we think about what technology is doing to humans and the sort of work that they do, nowadays, if you can give a job to a machine, you would probably do that, right? Because it's cheaper, more reliable, doesn't need vacations, doesn't need medical benefit, all that sort of stuff. And so we've seen that happen in the physical world, where robots are coming in and doing sorting in factories, a big best example. If we think about what's happening now with AI, increasingly AI is doing things and can do things better than people. So what are humans going to be doing going forward? And the answer is the stuff the machines can't bracket yet. And that's things that involve nuance, judgment, emotional intelligence, all those sort of human attributes. And what fascinates me in my work is I go, okay, if that's what's happening, those sorts of tasks, the reason we can't give it to machines is because they're not easily codifiable, right? What is being ethical? What is providing good customer service in one situation might not be in another. So as we push humans into those roles, that is simultaneously getting the best out of people. It is also when they pose the greatest amount of risk, because that is when they're kind of running on human fumes a little bit, if you like. And so from a risk perspective, people, there's this narrative of technology is going to make the world safer. It is in the physical world. It is definitely not going to do that in the kind of knowledge economy, cognitive world, because what we're doing is pushing people into roles where we're asking them to double down on being human. And that for me, I find a really interesting dynamic that we should watch and try and understand.
It's interesting what you said about the so the way that the AI is sort of modeled at the moment, obviously is based on everything that's online, and we're our worst selves online, right? So what would be nice, and actually what I heard in a podcast from Prof G, who's a marketing professor from NYU the other day, he was saying we should have trained AI on actual human systems in the real world, where we're much nicer to each other and actually behave by and large much more ethically than we do online. So it's a shame that it's been trained basically on our worst human behavior.
And that's the good argument, I think, for, this thing about sort of like, I'm going to be polite to the AI because one day when it takes over, right, I will have said please and thank you. And it's going to spare me from the apocalypse. I think there's a really good argument, I think, for being polite to AI, because bear in mind, every time we interact with it, we're feeding it in information and of course it's mirroring back to us. So I think that for me is a really strong argument of being intelligent about how we approach it and therefore being polite, right? And I think, because you're not going to single-handedly change it, but I think if enough of us do that, we can start to set the tone. But I agree with you. We should capture the realities of humanity. And I think we want to make sure that we're not scaling up the worst excesses of it, but we should try and amplify the things that are really good, the things that we want, a little bit like we do with kids, right? Where we're well behaved in front of them, right? No swearing in front of the children, and then we're cussing behind the scenes. Right? I think we need to think about the AI a little bit like that, right? It's in kids, it's indiscriminate gathering of data that it then does whatever, and it's not making sense of it. It's just looking for patterns. So we need to provide it to that point with pattern. And I think that's an interest. That's one of the other challenges, along with the overly white data on people like me is far more readily accessible than data on people that aren't like me.
So we've talked about what humans might be doing in the context of work and working with AI. I think the other question is then, Bill Gates has been quoted in the past couple of weeks saying that AI may give us a 2-day work week in the next 10 years, which actually sounds fairly optimistic. I would assume that there will be a lot of people who have 0-day work weeks in the next 10 years. So the question is also, what happens to us outside of work? Like, what are we when we are bored or purposeless, which, history would suggest we are actually quite dangerous when we're bored. And so what do you know to be true about human behavior that gives us clues about how humans will behave when automation removes our need to work?
So I think it's a great question. It's interesting because boredom is always perceived to be a negative, right? I was a bit bored, but actually I think sometimes boredom serves a useful purpose, because if we were constantly stimulated the whole time, we'd be overloaded, right? And we know what happens when we overload our brain with stuff. So boredom, I think, serves an interesting purpose. And I do a lot of train travel. So when I travel between Munich and London, I go by train. And the reason, partly environmental, but it's also because it's a really unique environment where I sort of sit there and ironically on a high-speed train, but I'm slowing things down and I'm kind of looking out the window and staring out the window and having random thoughts. And some of my best ideas and inspirations come from when I'm doing nothing, right? Just actually pointless activity. So I don't want to write off boredom and kind of not being stimulated as being bad things. I think, why do people go and do yogic retreats and meditation and those things? Because I think there is a space for not everything being a full-on sensation-busting, filling our eyes and ears with sort of stimulation. I think there are times where we just need that the Zen period in our lives. So I wouldn't want to necessarily say it's a bad thing, but as the old saying goes, the devil does make work for idle hands, right? So there is a risk associated with that, where people go off and do things. And I think there's interesting questions about loneliness in society that we need to watch. There's having time on our own is good, and being comfortable with our own company is good, but too much of it, and we turn into weirdos, right? And that leads to negative mental health consequences, let alone other things that we might do. So I think there's an interesting balancing act here. One of the things I have found really interesting moving from an employed situation to a self-employed situation is that it's the classic entrepreneur's challenge of the dividing lines. When does work stop and start? And Dan made that really interesting point around the sort of working day, right? You're used to the conventional patterns. And those conventional patterns, I don't think work for anybody, right? They're an average. Not every single person is going to be productive between the hours of 9 and 5. Right. For some people, the pattern, the biorhythmic pattern and the sorts of work, they'll be better suited to other things. And so I think there's a really exciting opportunity here to start crafting jobs for people in ways that work for them. And I always think back to the annual appraisals I get with employers. And I used to change jobs probably 3 to 4 years, right? I've realized that wasn't by accident. That was generally the amount of time where I sort of felt I got enough out of the situation, wanted to try a new challenge. And it was really funny because you'd end up with, in essence, what felt like Groundhog Day every single year, because the annual reviews would be the same. It would be like, here's your strengths, here's your weaknesses, development areas. And what was fascinating about it was development areas typically were, where is Christian not conforming to the box that we have put him in? And I kind of used to laugh about this, particularly as you're getting older, because you're sort of thinking, I've heard this crap before, right? The reason I'm not speaking up in those meetings is because I think the meeting's an effing waste of time, right? It's not because I don't understand the performance. I don't want to do that performative nonsense. I'm not interested in those aspects of the job. And so what I would always try to do in roles was to try and craft the role to be as close to me as possible, right? Do less of the things that I was crap at or didn't enjoy, and more of the things that I was good and did enjoy. And I would find excuses to, I'm giving a junior person the opportunity to work on this project, right? Sounds good. Development opportunity for them. It is good, right? But it's also me. I can't be bothered to do that. It's boring, right? It's not very interesting. And I would do things that were politically dumb, right? So I would go and find projects that I was interested in, like genuinely, personally interested in, that were probably political suicide. And I would avoid the high profile, tedious ones I didn't want to do because I was looking at it selfishly going, I want to develop for me, not what they want, because I'm not here for the longer term. And so you end up with these things that sort of go, why in the third year of my annual appraisal of a particular employer, if it's the same, you kind of sit there going, have you not learned anything? Right? There's no point in having this conversation with me. I am not going to go down that route because that doesn't work for me. Now, I'm a slightly unusual, quirky individual. But what certainly what I realized with self-employment was that I can do that all the time now. I shouldn't be, there's a small amount of things that we all have to do that's a bit tedious, but the vast majority of my work should energize me. There is no point in behaving as if you're employed if you are self-employed. Because you've lost all the benefits of employment, right? So you might as well take the advantage of self-employment. And I think one of those is to be able to craft a world so you get to work with people that inspire you on interesting problems in a pattern and a rhythm that works for you. And so I like to sort of try and style the world around what works for me. And I think that's the interesting bit. And so when I look at something like retirement, I'm never going to retire. I might do, I don't know what tiring is that we need to redo it. But anyway, I'm never going to retire because I'm just going to do less of it. But I'm going to find, because I don't want to, if you look at like people like Margaret Thatcher's always the best example for me. As soon as she left office, she just declined. You could see it, right? Physically and mentally declined because there was nothing going on. There was no stimulation and challenge. I don't want to be that sort of person. So I want to keep finding and doing interesting things. And therefore, I think this challenge of going from full-time occupied to not full-time occupied is a problem if that feels like a massive difference. For me, doing a bit more work or a little bit less work doesn't feel like a massive change. And I think people need to be helped to design careers that work for humans, that gets the best out of them, not design. Why do we have to hire people for full-time? If I look back at previous jobs I've had, I reckon there was probably 30% of my time, and that's probably being generous, that was a good use of my time. Because I was either being required to do tasks that I was crap at, had no interest in, right? Where there are other people that are interested in that, or that nobody should have been doing because they're utterly pointless. Now, that's not, you wouldn't sort of hire a robot and get it to do, we've got a spray robot that sprays cars. Oh, can we get it to do some accounts at the same? You wouldn't do that. And yet we do that with human beings. Right. So I think there's a big question here. Forward-thinking employers need to be starting to recognize that this is a two-way deal, that we should try and structure to the extent that we can, craft the jobs for humans and design structures around those humans. A little bit like sports teams work around the talents. The formation that the football team has is built around the sorts of talents you have on the team. And yes, the manager has their style of playing, but you combine those two things, right? You can't put a player into a system where their skills aren't being properly used. And I think we should think in those terms. And then that transition where we can start to think about having multiple jobs, multiple interests, some of which might be paid, some of which might be unpaid, I think will be much easier. And so my encouragement to people is to say that stop thinking about it as work or not work and recognize that it's life. And so these cut-off points that we have at the moment where there's such a big distinction between those two things, clearly it's not, if you're having to spend your time doing something that is not you, naturally you, and work feels tedious, that's not a great place to be. So we need to start shifting that. And that's what I think forward-thinking employers will do.
It must feel like the risk landscape is becoming ever more risky, which I guess it's a good time to be in risk, right? I mean, it must feel when you're dealing with these organizations, there must be aspects of, the risks of 30 years ago were far easier to respond to than the risks of today, right? And how do you help companies to address that uncertainty?
So what's interesting is that the fundamentals are the same, right? Because if we take my premise that humans are a major component, right? Not always the root cause, but they can kind of accelerate risk. If we look at that and say the human OS that we were running, a few decades ago is the same human OS we're running now. So what has changed? Well, the biggest change is technology, but then there are also social changes as well. And I would say, if we look at what technology does, it puts weapons of mass destruction from a reputational risk or an error perspective into the hands of humans across organizations. So junior people nowadays can pose a risk to organizations in ways they couldn't do in the past, right? So give someone an email address, and there is a risk, they're associated with your company, right? If somebody does something embarrassing, chances are journalists are going to want to find who do they work for, right? That becomes a sort of relevant reference point. And so having a LinkedIn account poses a reputational risk to your organization if they say something racist, right? It'll get linked back to you. And we've all seen those videos, which I think has gone, from my perspective, gone a bit too far, with people sort of, I'm filming this process so to put it online, right? So, and people, deliberate troublemakers to do that. But check-in staff, for example, much more vulnerable, able to cause embarrassment to an organization. Let's not even talk about the police force and so on and so forth. So the technology has enabled, put weapons of mass destruction in people's hands, but also allowed reporting and sharing of when things go wrong. And of course, we're all dealing in bigger numbers, right? So we have access to systems that can cause problems, and we can think about physical systems. We can think about just digital chaos. So all of those things allow that. And then there's greater transparency around that, and errors are scalable now. So you make a small error, it can blow up very, very, very quickly. And then the news cycle, the information cycle feeds into that. So as we look at it, on the one hand, it is really hard, right? Because there's all these things here. And if we think about the sort of woke culture, cancelling, all those sorts of questions, what is a risk nowadays? And something that you might have done or said some time ago, or you say to one particular audience, change that. There's a thing called context collapse, which I don't know if you've come across, which is where if you remove the context of a comment, this will be like an in-joke, a thing I might say to a friend who, if repeated to somebody else, might be offensive, right? But it's okay in that context. Collapse the context, put it somewhere else, it becomes offensive. And we start to see that happening as well, where somebody's, an in-joke might be appropriate amongst friends, massively inappropriate if it's broadcast publicly. But I come back to, it's fundamentals that we've always had. It's just that we only put weapons of mass destruction in the hands of senior executives, and there was no social media and blah, 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 blah going with it. And social norms, we were a bit more repressed and restrained in terms of, things were covered up in a way that they're not covered up now. So it feels like more of a nightmare, but actually I think the fundamentals are still there. So we can start to understand what might drive the problem. The solutions, I think, become a bit more challenging, and you have to, I think, be realistic about what is going on. And I think one of the solutions that people often come up with as a behavioral explanation to this is to kind of ignore it, right? So you see lots of organizations, AI, right? Let's ban AI. Now, I always say to any of my clients, right, you might have banned AI, but that does not mean AI is not being used within your organization, because the smart employees, and this is why you've hired them in the first place, remember, right? They'll be finding ways to use ChatGPT or whatever it is to be more effective at their role. The smart ones will just do it off the reservation. You will never know about it, but they will be doing it. And I know that because that's what I would have been doing, right? Even as a head of compliance responsible for a rule that I suspect would have been, you may not use generative AI for work purposes, I would have found a way to do it. No question, right? Why wouldn't, if it makes you smarter, more effective, allows you to, or kind of maybe helps you keep your job, of course you're going to do it, right? So recognizing those sorts of, those kind of, willful blindness dynamics are not helpful. I think, trying to overly control risk as well is a danger, right? So one of the solutions might be, well, we're gonna shut down any discussion about us publicly. And there's that brilliant. You've seen the book Careless People by the former Facebook employee. It's a brilliant new book. I've probably got the title wrong, but brilliant new book by a lady called Sarah Wynne Williams, which she was an insider at Facebook and has written this book. And Facebook basically took her to court to try and get the publication of the book banned. Which has, of course, just done what it always does, right? The book is now a bestseller, right? So this idea that we can control the narrative, that we can kind of lie about things, cover it up, spin our way out of trouble, I think is also dangerous. So when we look at the natural human responses to these complicated dynamics, I think the biggest mistakes we make is often not in the error itself, but it's in the attempt to cover it up, or the ignoring of it, or the pretending that it can be simplified, or pretending that we've got it all covered. I think the trick to this, for me, is recognize the complexity and recognize that your conventional solutions might not get there. And we will have a tendency as humans to do things that make our lives easier, kick the can down the road, ignore what's going on, not tell the truth, all those sorts of things. And that's the bigger problem there. So I think the behavioral solution to this isn't to say there is a simple solution to this. Recognize the complexity, and then recognize the likely paths that we might take, the structures that we might have, the sorts of people that we might put in positions to respond to these things. We need to make sure those people are open-minded. And this is where I think diversity is super helpful. because where we get typically organizations get blindsided because they don't understand the underlying dynamics, because they have got the wrong people responding to those things. So that is where we need to get younger people involved in things. You need to understand the technologies that are posing these risks. You need to understand the social trends that are there so that you can respond more effectively. And I would argue that one of the things that we do is we equate experience with expertise and ability to respond to situations. And that historically, in a world that hasn't been changing much, is true. Right? If you have spent your whole lifetime looking at something in a fixed environment, the sciences, for example, I'm talking the natural sciences as opposed to modern social sciences, in engineering, those sorts of things, right, where the laws of gravity don't change overnight. So those sorts of things, experience in dentistry, for example, those sorts of things, expertise, time spent doing something can lead you to a greater level of expertise. Therefore, your decision-making capabilities are great. Of course, that can also lead you to blindness because you think you know everything and you haven't spotted when the world has changed. And you might lead to arrogance and hubris. And we've seen lots of examples of that. But for some of these other social aspects, we need to recognize that actually the more time you have spent in a system may actually mean you pose a greater weakness. Like expertise and experience can be a dangerous thing. And that's why we need to bring fresh heads in, fresh perspectives, and recognize you. So I'm fascinated by the decision-making structures that we use and the control structures that we use to mitigate these risks, because those, I think, can bring out the worst in us, and recognizing those behavioral dynamics into how we respond, I think, is really important. So that was a very long answer, but hopefully
no, it's great. I mean, we need to wrap up, but surely this is exactly what we're seeing. This won't come out for a few weeks, but at the moment we've got our 90-day stay on tariffs being led by the U.S. government. Surely what we're seeing there in terms of decision making and some of the behaviors that are being brought to that context is throws a lot of these things that you're talking about into very bright light. So yeah, and the impact those decisions have on generating greater risk for everyone in the world. Is
and the bit that I'm really intrigued by in all of that is this. I would argue that is being driven by, and I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert in these things, but the individual that's behind those is very transactional in nature, right? The word deal comes up quite frequently, and if we look at a transactional view of the world, doesn't necessarily require you to build longer term trust. And I think when we're talking about politics and people in senior positions, you have to recognize that actually you have to cooperate with people. You have to keep doing business with them, right? Once you demonstrate that you're not trustworthy, that you can change things on a whim, then it becomes it's great for a negotiation tactic on a one-off, right? It's not so great in terms of the longer term relationships because people go, I don't know what you're going to do next. And that, I think, is the bit that's missed in this step, whether or not, and there's not even a comment on whether the tactics are smart, but you have basically demonstrated that you cannot be trusted to be consistent, and you've broken conventional norms. That's going to cause all sorts of ripple effects.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to assume that continuing to be trusted and respected is the ambition for the country. This doesn't obviously lend itself to that. Christian, this has been an amazing discussion. Thank you so much. I wish we had loads more time, but maybe you'll come back and talk to us again someday.
I'm always happy. If people are just prepared to let me talk, I'm always happy to show up. So thank you so much for being tolerant of my very long answers. But it's been absolutely great questions. And I love the premise of the show because I think, work is definitely weird. And it's been a pleasure to talk about that with you. So thank you.
Where can people find you?
LinkedIn is where I'm most active. If you just search for human risk on LinkedIn, or human-risk.com will take you to all the resources and things, the podcast book, all those kinds of things.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
And thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the episode. If you have any work is weird moments to share, please find us on LinkedIn and let us know what they were. In the meantime, have a wonderfully weird week, and we look forward to seeing you next time.